playing with Amazon Web Services. And it was just so crazy that in all these years I'd never looked at them. And I did not realize that Amazon Web Services had a lot to do with .NET. They have a whole team for .NET. They're really invested in it. So this is just a quick look at a recent blog post, actually from September last year. So AWS is not just a member of the .NET Foundation, but they're a big sponsor of the .NET Foundation. So that was also a surprise to me. And also they have so much resources for .NET developers. They've got a whole big team. And there's developer advocates, but there's also all kinds of tooling, and there's APIs. There's a CLI for using .NET with AWS services. There are extensions for Visual Studio Code, JetBrains Writer. There's PowerShell. There's actually more, but that's not the web page, so I can't scroll down on it to show you unless, wait, is this it over here? Oh, there's an actual web page. So you can kind of see, and you can get there at aws.amazon.com/net. So you can see there's just all kinds of stuff here, and evangelists, and I know at least one of the evangelists is on here. So I was a little embarrassed that was such a big surprise, that I had really never looked at it. So of course, knowing it was there, then I had to start playing with it. So what I want to do is, in the 25 minutes, obviously I can't do like intense demos or anything like that. But what I want to do is show you one of the things that I've done, which was I had an ASP.NET Core API that I built, just plain old ASP.NET Core API. And I actually was able to take that and publish it to AWS as a Lambda function because of the tooling and templates and everything that AWS provides. So I want to give you a kind of a high-level look at that. We'll look at some code, and I'll tell you how I did it, but I'm not going to actually go through and physically do the steps while we're watching because not quite enough time. I did write 2 articles so far for Code Magazine. One is going to be in the May-June issue, and the next one that is more focused on what I'm showing you here is going to be in the July-August issue, so more detail in there. So before I could do any of this, I did need an account on AWS, and you can actually, they have a free tier, so you can sign up for a free tier account. You get, there's all kinds of services with limitations, right? Like the database, you get it's free, but you get 750 hours for free, whatever. So, but there is a free tier that you could sign up for. And before you do any of this, so I'm going to actually be doing this work in Visual Studio using their toolkit. But before you can do that, you do need to have an account, and you need to go to AWS and create an account that's called the root user. But when you're doing your work and your development work and creating services, you shouldn't really use the root user. You can create these other like kind of sub-user accounts called IAM accounts. I suddenly forgot what that stands for. Anyway, so you need to have that before you can do any of this. And then the next thing, I'm using Visual Studio 2019, so I installed the AWS toolkit for that. And then when you first open up that toolkit in Visual Studio, the first thing it does is say, oh, wait, I need to have we need to be connected to an account. We need to have access to the credentials. So what you'll do is it'll walk you through it. You sign in with your root account, and then you create an IAM user account right through the toolkit. And then the toolkit will use that IAM user account to access services and do what it needs to do. So all of those things were set up in advance. So I started again with a project that I had already created, which was an ASP.NET Core API. So the really cool thing about this is I'm not I'm not just building an AWS Lambda function. Right? At the point where I kind of need to learn about how to build a Lambda function. What I did here, and that, that is a thing to do for sure. But what I did here was I had this API that I already created, and I was able to take this API. So all the skills I'm bringing to the table already as a .NET developer, right? Create this API, and then I could take this API and just using their tools and their templates without having to learn, oh, how do you write a Lambda function? I was able to publish this as a Lambda function. So Lambda functions, hopefully by now, they've been around for a long time. That's AWS's serverless offering. So this ASP.NET Core API, the one interesting thing I had done in advance with this, and started out pointing to, my SQL Server local DB on my development machine, but then I switched it to using SQL Server on AWS, right? I'm like, whoa, SQL servers on Amazon Web Services. So they have RDS, which is their relational database service, and within RDS are a whole bunch of relational databases: SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL. I'm missing some, but so there's a whole bunch of them. So, again, it was like, what? I had no idea. So along with this, the API, I needed a way to store my secrets. So my secrets are the login and password for the database, right? So I'm just using ASP.NET Secret Manager. That is, part of Visual Studio, part of ASP.NET, to have access to those credentials locally, and then startup knows how to read them. I'll show you what that code is. But then when you deploy it, the secrets need to be available for the deployed application. So what I also did was took advantage of AWS Parameter Store. That's one of the ways you can store secrets. And so I'm using AWS Parameter Store to store and then access the same credentials from the deployed application that's in the cloud. So that's what the original application did. All right. Now, what I'm going to transform this to you, I think it's really helpful. It was helpful for me to understand what it looks like once it's deployed. So the deployed app, what will happen is here, I've still got all my controller methods that are part of the API. And I don't have to make this happen, right? By using the template provided by the toolkit and using their publish feature, right? And that's not just in the toolkit, that's a feature that's exposed through the toolkit, but also you can do it through the CLI, you can do it through PowerShell. So publishing makes all of this happen. So it takes my API, my controller methods, and puts them behind a Lambda function. I'm not writing that. That's just part of what happens for me. Puts it behind a Lambda function. And the Lambda function, there's all kinds of ways you can trigger the Lambda function, but I'm coming through HTTP to access my API. So I'm going to be coming through an API gateway, right? I'm not going to call the function. It's like it doesn't have a direct URI that I'm going to call. I'll be going through a gateway to get there. And so publishing or deploying sets all of that up for me. And the huge benefit here, of course, when you're moving to serverless is rather than paying for the API to sit in the resources, right, and be paying compute charges just for it being there and living and waiting for requests, when you're behind the Lambda function, all you're paying for is each request that's coming into the function and the time that it takes for that request to do its job. And along with the free tier, the first 1 million requests every month are free. And then that also, there's another factor in there about the amount of time that's used to have those functions run the request, how long it takes to run each request. So I don't have to create any of that, which is, yay, right? I'm just building an ASP.NET Core API, just that's all, right? And then saying publish. So that's what I'm doing. So then, since I could start from scratch with the AWS template and build up my ASP.NET Core API. But what I happened to do was take an existing one and then transform it to a function. Now, I didn't take my project code base and then start modifying it. What I did was I created a new project using one of the templates that's provided through the AWS toolkit. And that gives you all of the infrastructure for the function and the deployment and all the things that it needs. And then within there, and I'll show you this quickly, within there, when you say, okay, I want to do a serverless application, it says, okay, what flavor of serverless application? And I said, I want an ASP.NET Core Web API. So it sets up the basics. Then what I did was I copied some files and some code from my original application into the new application. From there, I can just go ahead and run it in Visual Studio, debug, just like I always have. And when I'm doing that, I'm not even engaging any of the Lambda stuff yet. The Lambda stuff doesn't get used until it's deployed. So some of the things in the project are enabling you to deploy, right? Giving all of the assets that the deployment requires. And then other pieces of that are assets that get deployed along with your API in order for it to run in AWS as a Lambda function. After doing that, because I'm hitting that database, I did have to make a couple little more tweaks just to make sure that the container, the EC2 container that the Lambda gets published to, is allowed to talk to the VPC where the database is, right? Even though I have the access to the credentials, it still has to get there before it can pass the credentials. So I just had to do a couple things. So that's just an overview. And again, in that article, the second one of those articles, I go through all of this in great detail. I actually emailed Rod Paddock, who's the editor. I was like, this is going to be a little long. Is that okay? He said, yes, it's fine. So, okay, so let me flip over to first showing you a quick look at the Explorer. This is this AWS Explorer in the middle in Visual Studio. I'm in 2019. This is what you get by installing the toolkit. And in Visual Studio, it gives you access to a whole bunch of different services within AWS. So I have these EC2 containers. I've got some S3 buckets. RDS is where my databases are. So I just happen to have one. Now, this isn't a database right here. This is a database instance. So you create different instances. It's like creating a server, right? So this happens to be a SQL server, and then I have some databases within there. My original API that I built, the one that's not the Lambda function, I actually deployed it. And the quick and easy way to deploy it is through something called AWS Elastic Beanstalk. So I actually have that running on AWS. Down here are my Lambda functions, right? So everything that you have in your account, and notice it's filtered by region. So everything I have in this region is going to show up in here. So I'm going to auto hide that. And so I have, let's see, I have in my app settings, I have my connection string that points to the database, right? The SQL Server database that is on Amazon, hosted on Amazon. And in my So notice that doesn't have the password and user ID. And I'm composing my connection string in startup by reading that connection string, and configuration is going to go through the different places in ASP.NET that provide configuration information. So it's going to find the one in app settings. And then I also have configuration that has the DB password and DB user. So when I'm running this locally, that's coming from my user secrets. Don't look. Right, there they are. That's coming from my user secrets, and user secrets don't get deployed, right? And then at runtime, if we look at program, I'm using an extension that is going to give my application access to AWS System Manager, where my parameters are stored online. So it's going to know how to find those. And so those will get read, and they come in last to configuration. So when I'm in production, it'll get read from there. So I'm just going to run this quickly. I've used up all my time already, practically. That's okay. So, right, that just exposes, that's coming out of the database. I'm just going to close that. So then what I did was I created this new project. And again, I have all of these templates, project templates, because I installed the toolkit. And I'm going to pick serverless application. So not Lambda, right? I'm going to create a serverless application that's for an API, or it doesn't have to just be an API. So as a matter of fact, once you create that, then you have access to these blueprints. All right, and the blueprint that I chose is this one, ASP.NET Core Web API, period, right? Here's one with Razor pages. So let me choose that so you can see what's in there. Okay, so what this gives you off the bat is two controllers, like your standard values controller. And then this controller is one that interacts with S3 proxy. It's a proxy controller that gives you access to an S3 bucket in AWS, right? So that's just a controller. That's not a key part of how this all is going together. That's just, the thing that we're choosing to do as our controller, like access the bucket and do some stuff with it. So those are the default controllers that are in there. So you've got kind of a stake in the ground. App settings has a little placeholder for the name of that bucket if you're going to be using that proxy controller, right? But notice also there's configuration for the Lambda tools, right? And some of this information is used for deployment. And also, if you notice, there's no program.cs file. So actually this local entry point, that is the program CS file. It is exactly the same as my other program, as a default program CS for ASP.NET Core. So when I'm running locally, that is what is going to get started, right? There's also this Lambda entry point. When you deploy this to AWS, this is the starting point of the application. So you can't run this locally, right? It only when it's hosted on AWS, and you can't just like emulate the environment on your computer. Here's probably the most important file, the README. It's really, really informative file about just explaining what is in this template and what the different pieces, what the different files are for. So that's really, really helpful. Serverless template is also really important. There's a lot of information in here. And it also is related to deployment and assets that get pushed into, and information that drives how things are created when you publish the application. And then the startup file, right? And this there's a little bit of information in here that relates to that controller. All right, so that's what the template looks like. So you could just start building your own ASP.NET API, web API right here. What I did was then, as I said before, I copied a lot of the files and assets from the original project into that what I got from that template. So I took out the S3 proxy controller and put my authors controller in there. I've got, you know me, I've got my entity framework, DB context here, and I'm doing just some basic seeding of the database. But there's that JSON file that has some of the deployment information. There's the Lambda entry point. I added in, oh, there's my migration files that I created in the other one. I did add back in that configuration information for reading the parameters. And my startup file, I copied in the code that I had for setting up the database, right? So I just transferred all of that logic into this existing template. And then I was able to right-click, right? Right-click on the project and say, publish to AWS Lambda, right? That was it. It did all this publishing, it goes through its deployment processes, and in the end, it created, it has information about some high-level information about configuration and doing some things here when you're going through the AWS Explorer. So here's just some information about the function. But more interestingly is what this looks like in the portal. So, so here's the function itself. So there's the function that got created. Here's the gateway that deployment process created, and some different assets that were created. Now, when I was showing you the list of things I needed to do, one of those steps was to ensure that the EC2 where this lives is allowed to talk to the VPC where my database lives. And I had to configure this, and you can actually do that through configuration here. This is what I'm doing here. So I'm not creating a VPC to host the function. I'm saying this is the VPC that you need, I want you to be able to access, right? And the subnets are exposed by the VPC, there's security groups in there, so you just select them. And again, yeah, this is really, really high level, just so you get an idea of what's going on. There was one last piece that I needed to do. Because I tied this to the VPC, it then meant that that VPC, that subnet from the VPC, needed permission to talk to the parameter store. So if I flip back to the parameter store, where here, it's in Systems Manager. I learned so many things. Look at me moving around this portal like I know what I'm doing. Okay, parameter stores here, right? So I needed it to access the parameter store so that it could read these things. And what I had to do in order to do that was create an endpoint. Oh no, it's, I have to go to EC2. No, I have to go to VPC. Well, I created an endpoint on the VPC that then allowed my function again to be able to connect and read all that stuff. So once this was all deployed, then the last thing is that I can access the API. And we just have to cross our fingers. Dun, 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 dun. So that's the URL for the API. And it was, oh, come on. What's going on? It was working before. There it is. Dun, 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 dun. So right there it is. It's this, I have access to all the same controller methods that I had before, but now they're behind the Lambda, and I'm only paying for the Lambda requests, the request of the Lambda function, and I didn't have to, I'm going to because I'm curious, but I didn't have to learn anything about how to write Lambda functions yet. So that was pretty amazing for me to make these discoveries. And that is what I wanted to share. So just a quick review. All I did was, create the template, the project from the template, copied things. I debugged, I don't think I just did that. Yes, I did. Debugged, I can do all my debugging locally. And the interesting thing about debugging locally is we're not using any of the Lambda stuff there. So it's just regular ASP.NET Core that we're using. And so I did those steps. Here are, again, to get to that homepage for .NET is just awsamazon.com/net. The toolkit is AWS Amazon Visual Studio. And then the free tier, to sign up for a free tier, except without that typo, is awsamazon.com free. And again, I've got some more detailed articles coming up in Code Magazine. And the last thing I want to make sure you know is it's still another week of Pluralsight totally free. I just want everybody always to know that, by the way, total free access to Pluralsight, all of its courses. And there's a quick short link for you. And did I leave? I left -1 minutes to have questions and answers. Should we do them after Ian finishes?
I think let's do it now.
Okay. We'll just put a little timer on it. Is there a chat window, or are people just going to turn on their microphones?
So it would be if someone wants to speak. So yeah, you can turn on your microphone and it would. So who will be the first? Do we need to give prizes now for the questions?
I'm happy to have a prize. I was curious to know, is this deploying one Lambda or multiple Lambdas? Because you had that diagram with multiple controllers.
Yeah, that one was confusing to me at first. I thought it was one Lambda. I thought it was creating one Lambda function per controller method, but it's actually just one Lambda function that knows how to route through to the different controllers. Norm, are you still there? I got that right? I'm still working out all those details. I see Norm's on there. Well, he might not have heard. But yeah, it's just creating one Lambda function. And you saw, actually, remember I showed you the UI, right, for the Lambda. You could, when it even shows it visually that it's just a single function. Do you want to chime in, Norm?
Are you hearing me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I lost the mute button. Yeah, it is just one Lambda function that's created, and it's relying on ASP.NET Core's routing, basically figure out which controller that gets sent in there.
Yeah.
So basically, we just convert.
I learned.
You did an excellent job. Basically, we just convert what API gateways HTTP requests look like to what ASP.NET Core expects requests look like, and then we let ASP.NET Core do its magic. So.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious, was anybody else as surprised as I was that all this exists?
You can raise your hands there.
Yeah, if you got your video on, I guess, raise your hand. Or just, whatever.
I have a question. First, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. But there's one thing that I'm a little bit confused of, because I thought that, Lambda functions was for something a function that you want to be able to run fast, and that this function should also be able to scale. and that you not necessarily need to take care of state. But how does that sort of go hand in hand with exposing a REST API through a Lambda function?
I totally agree. And I at first I was like, but wait a minute, there's all this code there and all this ceremony and all this infrastructure code there. Like, why is that? And again, Norm can chime in after, but my perspective on it is, yes, that's what Lambda functions are for, but AWS said, hey, as long as we've got these functions, why don't we enable this scenario, right? So it's not taking advantage of those other aspects of serverless, but what it's so the big win, the big two wins in my mind are, well, the first is that you're still only paying for the function requests, right, as opposed to having it hosting. And then I didn't have to learn anything new. So in this case, I'm not benefiting from those other aspects of what serverless is all about. Does that ring true to you, Norm?
Is there
more to it?
And I think there's not. I wouldn't say there's really anything but using the ASP.NET Core. I call this our bridge library that takes away from the serverless experience. I will say there's a little bit of a hit you take on the cold start. It's over the additions of ASP.NET Core that's gotten greatly reduced as .NET Core has gotten a lot faster. I think the main reason, this is one of those, every team is different. And like Julie wanted to come in here and figure out how this works, but she didn't necessarily want to do all the cognitive load of how to write a Lambda function. She knew how to write an ASP.NET Core function. And this got her very quickly up and running and being able to write things as she knows how to write things. You could definitely get more bare bones and be more exact about your Lambda functions. That can make life easier and have lower, reduce your cold starts. But you will also run into, now I've got 100 Lambda functions I'm managing, and how do I do all that? Versus now my DevOps is managing one Lambda function. So it's trade-offs, and it depends on what your use case are and what your teams are. So my main goal usually, I'm the writer of this library, is really I'm trying to enable as many possibilities as possible. And to me, this is a very easy way to get started, and it's kind of a fun way to do it, but definitely not the only way to do it.
Mm-hmm. So David was asking, I don't know if it's the same or not, is cold startup still an issue with Lambda?
Julie, did you want me to take that, or do you want to?
Yeah. Since you know that.
I didn't mean to jump in and take over. So,
and we should be respectful of Ian's time also, just with, for how much time we should take for Q&A. That's not to you, Norm. That's just about the questions.
Okay.
I'll go ahead, don't worry.
The great thing about .NET Core is .NET Core is getting faster and faster. We released 3.1 support about a month ago. And so for those that don't know, cold start is the experience of like the first time you make a request and there's no compute compiler currently running, serving your Lambda function. The Lambda service has to go in and get that up and running. And in this case, it's also starting up the ASP.NET Core runtime. That has reduced quite a bit over the additions. 3.1 added the ability to do the ready to run, which let you to do all the pre-jetting, which really reduced the cold starts. If it's still the cold start's not at a level that you can deal with your SLAs, Lambda also added support for, you can have what they call it, provision concurrency. So you can just say, hey, I know I always am going to have about roughly this amount of requests going on there. So make sure I already have this much compute capacity already turned on for this machine. And if you go beyond that, then it'll go back to the regular, it's going to spin up compute resources to match that bursted load above that. So there's a lot of options for you on that.
Thanks, Norm. Anything else? Or?
Yeah, there is, I don't know if you can see our chat. Keir
no.
is asking, given that it is a single function, is there some kind of limit of to the size of API you could deploy? Would I hit a memory limit?
Oh, gonna have to defer to Norm again on that one. I just like to go in and see how things work. Like,
so when you deploy your Lambda function, you dedicate how much RAM memory you want on it. That can be, and this is like on a per, like, you have to remember this is like how much memory you need on a per request basis. So that can be as low as 128 megs or up to 3 gigs. That's on like per request, so that can go quite a bit. Also, when you do that memory, that also adjusts how much CPU power is being put on your Lambda function. So the name is a little misleading by saying it's just memory. As far as the actual like size of the application, as I recall, and I could be wrong, so the compressed version of your application, because when Julie uploads it, she's uploading a zip file. I think that has a maximum of 50 megs unless you use layers and it gets more complicated. But I think the going way started is, think about it. You want to make sure your zip file is less than 50 megs for your deployment bundle, which I think they're generally, like, I think Julie's function here is probably less than a meg.
does it show somewhere like in the toolkit or something?
It does show in the toolkit. I think if you use, yes, code size up there, I guess it's 3 megs.
Oh, there,
wide.
3 megs. There it is, right up
Okay.
here.
Yeah. So that's including all your Nougat dependencies and things like that outside of what's included in the runtime.
Great, good question, because now I'm learning even more.